All right. So I do have a few notes I need to read before we start this morning's meeting. So I will try to uh, be a good boy and do what I'm asked to do and try to not mess anything up today. It's welcome back virtually to members and welcome to all viewing the meeting remotely. Before we begin, I have a few notes to announce about conducting virtual meetings. The meeting will still must comply with the requirements of the Open Meetings Act accordingly. The public may view the meeting via a link provided in the advertised agenda, which can be found online at the KDE website. LSAC members must ensure their video is streaming and they can be seen throughout the duration of the meeting. LSAC members may mute their microphone when not talking. However, all discussions must be broadcast to the public. Therefore, superintendents should ensure their microphones is not on mute when speaking. For any items that require a roll call vote will be necessary to record the vote of each superintendent. And we would ask that you announce your name when making a motion or a second, just for clarification. Please mute or turn off cell phones and other mobile devices so as to not interrupt the meeting. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started, and we will jump into regulations for review and action. Kentucky Board of Education policy does not require two readings of regulations. Per recent discussions of the KBE, the board will discontinue the practice of two readings unless the board chair determines that additional readings are necessary. The following regulations, although the first readings will not have second readings and will require an action by the council. So we will jump into first the amendments to 703 KAR 5:240, the administrative procedures and guidelines. And we have Ms. Rhonda Sims and Jennifer Stafford from the Office of Assessment and Accountability from the Kentucky Department of Education. Welcome, ladies.
Hey, thank you. Thank you so much, Chair, and good to see everybody online today. Hope you're well and enjoying this beautiful spring in Kentucky. We come before you with a pretty simple amendment. I want to give you a little background of why we're here. Kentucky participated starting back, I think, in August of last year in a Kentucky Consolidated Performance Review, which is a type of federal audit of title programs. And as part of that audit process, there is a list of findings at the end of the audit as well as recommendations. Findings you're required to take action on and make corrections to. So Kentucky, for many years, with being more precise in our looking at exemptions from state testing, we had two categories of exemption. We talked about medical exemption, and we also talked about extraordinary circumstances. And so both of those terms were used. As part of the audit, we provided information that was requested from the federal level during the audit process of how many students are being exempted. It's a relatively small number on both, but our finding was that we cannot have that category of extraordinary circumstances. So this regulation was last effective in April of 2020. So very recently, we have gone through the full process for this regulation of 240, which is a procedures and amendment or procedures, accountability procedures regulation. So we are bringing forward to you the necessary change to be in compliance and to take action on this audit finding. And so I'm going to have Jennifer to point out exactly what it is and where it is in the reg, or describe that and give some additional detail of how we're processing and this in place. Now, I do want you to think about it as a group. You know, a lot of our regs are very complex, and so we've taken additional time and two readings and those kind of things. This is one that we think, because of what we're changing and the motivation behind the change, that might be appropriate for one reading of the reg, but we'll get your opinion on that as well here this morning. So Jennifer, let me kick it to you and let you talk to them just a little bit about how this might impact, you know, how we're going to work with this in the future, and certainly what the exact change is.
Thank you, Rhonda, and good morning, everyone. As Rhonda mentioned, we did go through a consolidated review from the U.S. Department of Education, and with that, the department looks at all of our title programs, and the statewide assessment is one of the title programs that they look closely at. Within the findings, they did see the extraordinary circumstance as a non-participation in our state assessments. Now, I think it's because it's due to the pandemic that they had a little extra time to look at the details of our assessment, because we've been implementing an extraordinary circumstance for years, and they have not really said anything about it. So I think that they had a little bit more extra time this year and looked at more at the details. So with the extraordinary circumstance, it was a finding, and they had required actions for the Kentucky Department of Education to take. With the extraordinary circumstances, we will be removing that as a non-participation. Now, they do allow a medical non-participation. So with the maturity of our assessment system and our accountability system, along the years, we've become more fine-tuned. And a lot of the extraordinary circumstance non-participation are actually medical non-participation. With the fact that we've just more fine-tuned those, we can utilize the medical definition to transfer those non-participations from the extraordinary circumstance to the medical non-participation. So we're expanding again that definition of medical to include both social, emotional, as well as physical in non-participation, where we had previously used many of the maybe social emotional pieces as an extraordinary circumstance. And I'll give you one example. For example, if a student lost a loved one, if they had, maybe their parents had unfortunately passed away, or a sibling or a grandparent that had an emotional toll on the student that could impact their performance on state assessments, we would have called that previously an extraordinary circumstance. With our definition of medical being social, emotional, as well as physical, that will now, that type of example would be included in a medical non-participation. So many of the participations, non-participation pieces will transfer over to a medical non-participation. So you can see within the regulation itself, we're just literally striking through the extraordinary circumstance language, and this is evidence that we will have to provide to the U.S. Department of Education that we are taking the step. Now, we have in this past February DAC trainings for preparation for state assessments this spring, we have trained that this step is going to take place, and this step with the regulation is getting in alignment with the practice we are now implementing this spring. So again, it's just a step to align the regulation to remove the extraordinary circumstance as required by the U.S. Department of Education. And I'll pause there and see if members have any questions.
Right. See if you have any questions for us. If this is one you are in agreement as a one read kind of experience for the board and for you as a group as well. So we'll pause there, Chair, and hand it back to you and see where we are.
Any questions from the body? We all know that sometimes those circumstances do arise with kids and testings. And again, when a child loses a loved one or someone close to their family or a caregiver, would you all have a suggestion there for that circumstance or situation?
Well, we would invite them to submit an exemption form.
Okay.
And we think we could handle that as a mental health medical exemption.
Gotcha.
So, I can't tell you that every really bizarre circumstance can get covered in exemption under medical, but a lot of the routine ones we get can be.
Okay.
Because, if a traumatic event happens to a child, it is impacting their physical and mental health.
Gotcha.
And so I think we can make sure we keep that focus on the definition of medical exemption and not have it just as a physical, a child broke their leg and are on pain meds or broke their arm. And so, obviously we want to do right by kids. And so we want to try to do that as best we can within the confines that we're going to be required to do here for the federal level. And so we'll turn in, obviously how we've talked to you as a group, how we've talked to the board. That's all part of our evidence of making that change. And as Jennifer said, we think they just had more time because we've done this for years and it's never been pointed out as an issue, but it was this time.
Okay. So if there's no other questions, we'll move on to I will need to have a motion to approve amendments of 703 KAR 5:240 administrative procedures and guidelines.
Mr. Chair, this is David Raleigh with LaRue County Schools. I'd like to make a recommendation to amend 703 KAR 5:240 to remove extraordinary circumstance as an exemption option from the state testing and only allow medical exemptions to that amendment.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Raleigh. Do I have a second?
Danny Atkins, I'll second.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Atkins. At this time, we'll have a roll call, and I'll ask Ms. Meredith to take us through the roll call, please.
Absolutely. Danny Atkins,
Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Biggerstaff,
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Tim Bobrowski,
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett,
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox,
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale,
Keith Hale, yes.
Sheila Mitchell,
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdell,
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
Russ Tilford.
Russ Tilford, yes.
Okay. We have all the votes accounted for there. We'll now move to amendments to 703 KAR 5:070, inclusion of special populations in the state required assessment and accountability programs. And again, we have Ms. Rhonda Sims and Jennifer Stafford. And we also, according to our agenda, have Kelly Foster from the Office of Continuous Improvement and Greta Hilton from the Office of Special Education and Early Learning, both from the Kentucky Department of Education.
Thank you, Chair. In a similar process for at least the change we're bringing forward with the assessment area that Jennifer will talk about in a moment, it was the input for that was from another finding with the consolidated audit. But this regulation is one that governs how do we assess particular groups of students. So it includes English learners, it includes our students with disabilities and that qualify for IEPs. It includes our alternate assessment program students. And so because of the broadness of the regulation, we're opening it as a result of the audit. It was last opened and became effective in 2016, was our last major change. But because of the opening of the reg, we also invited our partners in Kelly Foster's office and Greta Hilton's office to look at the reg to see if there was any cleanup of language, any sorts of things that needed to occur to, again, make the reg better, make it easier for people in the field to use. This one, because it's a document incorporated by reference, it's a little messy to see the changes because there's a lot of strike throughs and some language has been moved around to make the flow of the final document better. And of course, we do training materials tied to these once everything would be approved. I will point out to you that in your materials, you have a summary of changes that goes into great detail about all of the changes suggested. These changes I would describe, other than putting into place one change from the audit for assessment and accountability, most of the changes are to clean up language, to simplify it and to sort of take care of areas where we have gotten questions and confusions from the field before. And so I'm going to lead with that, and then I'm going to turn this over to Kelly to talk with you a little bit, Dr. Foster, about the issues in the area of English learners that they're suggesting changes. Then we're going to turn it over to Greta Hilton to talk about her area, and then we're going to come back with Jennifer to very quickly highlight for you the change that's motivated with assessment and accountability. Kelly, can I kick it off to you?
Sure. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good to see everybody virtually. We've got some nice spring weather out there that will hopefully stay around for a little while. Our pieces in this are just a tad bit different because we are making some changes, not necessarily from the federal audit on KDE, but we're making some changes based on when we do consolidated monitoring and auditing of our programs within your districts. We found some things that we feel like we can clean up to make life a little bit easier for you all and to make the reg a little cleaner. So I'm just going to quickly go through the changes in the reg around the EL sections. So one of the major changes that you will see if you compare the old reg to the proposed reg is the format of it. And so we did some rearranging of some sections regarding EL. And so we now have, it flows a little bit differently. We now have the definitions at the first, identification second, and then testing requirements third. And we just felt like that flowed a little bit better for everyone being able to read through and follow it. We make some small language updates throughout the reg to align with ESSA. We create a definition for the program service plan known in the districts as the PSP. We also created a requirement that schools and districts use the KDE created home language survey, and there are a few reasons for that. If every district is using the same home language survey, then we can eliminate some findings that are found in the civil rights audit findings. Sometimes districts are written up because the survey is not up to par. So KDE is going to have a KDE created home language survey that every district will have access to. And then also our plan with that survey is to translate that into several translate that into several languages that districts will have access to free of charge. The next change is that the EL monitoring performed in this regulation will move from 2 to 4 years, and this will also align that with ESSA. And then it defines the membership of the PSP, the Program Service Plan Committee, and that membership would include a parent, a regular ed teacher, an EL teacher, someone who can interpret the evaluation of the results, an individual who has knowledge or expertise regarding the child at the discretion of the parent, related services personnel as appropriate, the child if appropriate, and many of you all will recognize that mirrors an ARC committee that you're very familiar with. And then this also adds an opt-out procedure for parents, which is a federal requirement. So once again, our pieces from OCIS are just reorganizing and cleaning it up to align with ESSA and to make it a little bit easier to follow. So I'll be glad to take any questions about those now or at the end. It doesn't matter.
Any questions for Ms. Foster? Dr. Foster, I should say.
All right. Well, then I will turn it over to Greta.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Foster. So as much like what Dr. Foster said, the Office of Special Education and Early Learning took this opportunity to jump into this to clean up some language and make it more specific and align with the current language that's applicable today for students with disabilities. So I'm going to take just a moment and walk through those changes with you. While I'll ask that you keep in mind that there's really no significant changes, mostly just language updates. So we updated the language that the ARC is responsible for determining the accommodations, and that that it will be supported by multiple sources of current and longitudinal data. We removed terms that were we believe to be a little more vague, like education plan, and included more specific language such as IEP or 504 plan. We also added the statement that the IEP must be reviewed and revised annually. Again, this is something you're already doing in your districts. We just wanted to be sure that it was within the document. And then we changed the reference of alternate assessment program to Kentucky alternate assessment, which is more current language. And we removed section C, the inclusion of students with disabilities in the measure of the percentage of students making successful transitions to adult life, because the language is included in KRS 158-645, and it's not needed in the manual. So again, very basic, non-substantive changes to just specify language and clean it up and get it in line with the language that your districts are accustomed to around students with disabilities. Any questions about that? All right, thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Rhonda.
Hey, thank you, Greta.
Before we move to questions and answers,
Sure.
if everyone could please turn their cameras on. I do apologize. All superintendents participating need to have their cameras on.
Thank you, Meredith.
Thank you.
At this point, I want to have Jennifer walk through for you just the change that kind of, again, opened the reg, which came out of the audit findings. So we have one change around English learners and the assessment of English learners. So we want to highlight that. That's the reason for the opening of the reg. But as you've seen, we've been able to do some cleanup, some simplification, but not substantive sort of change. So Jennifer, you want to highlight for the group our change for assessment and accountability?
Yes, thank you. Again, the motive of opening the inclusions regulation was because of the finding. As part of the U.S. Department of Education audit that we mentioned earlier, they did find that within our regulations was the stipulation that kindergarten English learner students was not able to exit EL status based on performance on an English language proficiency exam. With the finding within that audit, there is the requirement that kindergarten students shall be able to exit from the program if they show and demonstrate that they meet the benchmark. So the motive was to open this regulation and remove that category that says that kindergartens are not allowed to indeed allow them to exit EL status based on their performance on an English language proficiency exam. While we were in there, removing that kindergarten piece, we also removed some language that just seemed to not fit into the regulation, specifically on simplified language and paraphrasing. The directions that we've always given on paraphrasing and simplified language is that can be given to all students on the directions only. So none of the test items or none of the questions can be paraphrased or simplified in any way, only the directions. And the fact that this is an inclusions of special populations regulation, we didn't feel like it fit here because that's a accommodation or a piece that can be given. It's not really an accommodation because it can be given to anyone. If a student asks a question about the direction, whether they're a regular ed student or a special ed student, they can be given simplified language or paraphrasing. So those two things are being removed from the regulation. However, they're not being removed from practice. So we removed those from the document incorporated by reference. We also removed some language about a reader being either text to speech or human, because we see from the department that a reader is a reader, whether it's speech to text from a computer or whether it's a human reader. So we have removed just that language, but not the practice. So just want to be transparent in the fact that that change is being made, but no change to the process. So those are the big pieces from assessment and accountability.
So Chair, we'll see if you have any questions now that we've kind of gone through the full change. And again, this is one that because we are initially putting in the finding on allowing kindergartners to exit if they meet the benchmark when they take the English proficiency test or access for kindergarten. And also these changes that are kind of cleanups, restructuring the language, again, trying to make it easier to use at the school and district level. We consider this one, again, a potential for one read only, if you all are in agreement with that. So I'll pause at that point and see, Chair, what you might have for us.
Okay, well, let's first see if we have any questions. Again, I'll reiterate that and see if we have any questions from the group today. All right, hearing none, I do have just one, and I guess I'll address it, Jennifer, to you, but, and I'm just going to give you a personal kind of example here. So my son is, he can't read, he can't write, he can't walk. He has those type issues, right? So he's 16 years old. So the way he would be assessed, and we're talking about state assessment, not practices. He would then have a reader as he's had. Is that correct? And did I understand that the option is available to have a read to text as well?
It is. We have, it's dependent on the assessment program that we're talking about. Many of our assessment programs have the speech to text, specifically the K-Prep.
Right.
The alternate assessment does not have speech to text. The ACT online, they have accommodations for students as well. So it varies depending on the assessment program. But yes, the change in the regulation is not substantive. I just wanted to bring that out and point that out to you in case you were asked a question about it, because that could potentially be controversial. That speech to text and human reader is being removed from the regulation, but just to say reader, because the way we feel is that whether it is a computer reading it or a human reading it, it's still a reader.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate that.
Thank you for the question.
Any other questions? Okay. Do I have a motion to approve amendments to 703 KAR 5070, inclusion of special populations and state required assessment accountability programs?
This is Kelly Bransfield, and I'll make that motion that we do that on one reading.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Ransdale. Do I have a second?
Russ Tilford. I'll second the motion.
Okay. All right. So Russ, we have a second on that. Harry, I saw your hand go up, but we couldn't hear you.
Yeah, that's my bad.
Okay.
That's good. I appreciate Kelly and Russ taking care of that.
You got some good partners there, buddy. They got you back. All right. Thank you so much for that. We will need to have a roll call, Ms. Meredith, at this time.
Okay. It does appear we're having some issues with the Teams platform, so I do apologize. I think that you have your cameras on, but we can't necessarily see you. So I would ask that if I call your name and ask you to turn your camera on and off, it's because on my feed I cannot see you, and we'll hope that that resets things. Danny Atkins.
Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Biggerstaff.
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Okay, perfect. Tim Bobrowski. And
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Chair, I cannot see your video feed. Can you try to turn off your camera and turn it back on? Okay, well, I will document your yes. Harry Burchett?
Harry Burchett, yes.
Ah, there, we can see you now, Chair.
Okay.
Tom Cochran.
Tom Cochran, yes.
Okay. David Cox.
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale,
Keith Hale, yes.
Sheila Mitchell,
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes. And I would like to send some CARES money down to Housing County, help the chair get better internet access.
thank you. Kelly Ransdell,
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
and Russ Tilford.
Russ Tilford, yes.
And Superintendent Ransdell, I do not see your video feed, so if you could turn your camera off and on, and we'll see if that works. Okay, Chair, all members have voted.
Did that work?
I don't think so. We'll move on and we'll try to work on it from our end.
Okay, we'll go ahead and move forward. Repeal of 701 KAR 5:080 application for approval of alternative school-based decision-making model. Ms. Kelly Foster from the Office of Continuous Improvement for the Kentucky Department of Education.
Good morning again. So the next two items I have, and we'll kind of do them simultaneously, but I believe Meredith is going to take two separate votes on those. The first one you mentioned, KAR 5:080. We are going to repeal this regulation, and basically what we're trying to do, there are currently two regs out there around site-based, and we're trying to get that down to one. And so what we're going to do is take the application piece out of 5:080 and put the application into 701 KAR 5:100 that I will talk about shortly. So at this point, the request is to move forward with the repeal of 701 KAR 5:080. And this would be the one and only reading for it as well.
And Ms. Kelly, we did move you up a little bit on the agenda there so we could get you back to doing the great things that you're doing. And we know you were in kind of a hurry there. So what I've done, members, is I've kind of jumped ahead just a little bit, if you will, on the page. So hopefully it's not caused any confusion. But again, I'm out. We are out of order just a tad on the agenda. But nonetheless, we can take the choice now, and I guess I'll ask Mr. Allen if he will advise as to what we need to do at this point. We started a presentation, no actions have been taken. Do we need to stay where we're at, or do we need to jump back and get back on the agenda?
No, Chair, you're fine to take those out of order. That's fine.
Okay, that'll be fine. Okay, so let's go ahead then, and any questions from the group about the approval of alternative school-based decision-making model?
And Chair, this will be just for the repeal, and then Dr. Foster has a presentation about the amendments to the reg. So this is just the vote for the repeal.
Just for the appeal. We'll need to go ahead and do a roll call, please.
We'll need a motion to repeal.
Chair Grabowski, this is Tom Cochran. I make that motion to repeal 701 KAR 5:080.
This is David Raleigh. I second that motion.
Chair, would you like me to proceed with the roll call?
Please do so.
Okay. Danny Atkins.
Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Biggerstaff.
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Tim Bobrowski.
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett.
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran.
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox.
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale.
Keith Hale, yes.
Sheila Mitchell.
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh.
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdell.
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
And Russ Tilford.
Russ Tilford, yes.
Okay, Chair, all members have voted. So I believe now we will hear the proposed amendments to KAR 5100.
Okay.
Okay,
Ms.
moving,
I'm
moving,
sorry, Kelly, go ahead.
okay, moving forward to the next piece, as Meredith mentioned, we're now going to look at 701 KAR 5:100 and some amendments to that. As I mentioned earlier, the one piece from the reg that we're repealing, the application will be now move into this regulation. Do want to kind of go through a summary of what the changes are. We are reducing the number of regulations, as I mentioned earlier, and trying to get everything into this one reg. We are clarifying procedures and creating a timeline for submission of alternative SBDM model applications. We are setting a standardized effect date for newly appointed, approved alternative SBDM members, and we're codifying the requirements that align with the SBDM statute. So we'll take a look at the slides. The next slide, please. You will see in the regulation that we have some things that are bolded and underlined. And then we'll have some other things in the upcoming slides that I highlight. The bold and the underline in the slides are the new information. The other items have just been moved around in the regulation. So looking at section 1 of the reg, none of this, section 1 defines parents shall have the same meaning as defined in KRS 163.45, and teachers should have the same meaning as defined in 163.45. Section 2 is when we move into some new language, and that is the bold and the underlined pieces, and I'll go through those. As I mentioned earlier, we're creating a timeline for the creation and submission of an alternative model application. So if a council wants to submit an application, they need to do that between January 1 and March 1. This creates a 30-day timeline for the referral of applications to the KBE meeting. It also requires KBE to review applications at the meeting following the 30-day referral window. It establishes the date for the implementation of new alternative SBDM models as of July 1. And it clarifies that applications for alternative SBDM models are not required for changes that maintain the statutorily required membership ratios and add non-voting members. So typically what happens is in the June board meeting, that sometimes it's other times throughout the school year, but the majority of them are the June board meeting. We typically receive requests for councils that want to add non-voting members, either a student or a classified person, and they have to bring those requests to KBE. And so what this reg does, it's making the change where councils do not have to do that anymore. If they want to add a non-voting member to their local council, they can do that without having to bring that to the Kentucky Board of Education. Next slide, please. Section 3, I will go through the dark underline print. As I mentioned before, that it creates a new timeline. January 1 through March 1 is when those applications would need to be submitted. It requires exemptions to SBDM to be referred to the KBE. It establishes the date for implementation of the exemptions, SBDM exemptions as of July 1, and requires schools to reapply for SBDM exemptions annually. Section 4, the next slide, we've just moved items around. There's no new language. Section 5, the next slide, additionally, no new language, just move some things around. And then section 6 is incorporating that alternative school-based decision-making application that was in the reg that we plan to repeal. So once again, this really just gives additional flexibility to schools and districts that they won't actually have to apply to KBE if they're wanting to add a non-voting member, a classified person, or a student member, as long as that ratio that's identified in the statute stays the same. So I think this will be a real positive moving forward for local councils. And that's all I have.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Foster. Do I have a motion to approve the amendment to 701 KAR? Let's see, hold on, make sure I'm on the right page here. 701 KAR 5:100 guidelines for alternative models for school-based decision making.
Chair,
Yes.
do we have opportunity for questions or discussion?
We do. Questions or discussions?
Just one question, Dr. Foster. Well, one question, maybe a follow-up question. I'm not sure. I want to praise you for the making it easier to add a non-voting student member and those type things. Very positive moves, I believe. I was just curious about how many schools, or do you know how many schools still remain exempt under KRS 160.345 subsection 5?
Okay, you're going to have to give me a little bit more than that. Exempt from not having a council?
Yes, exempt from the SBDM from not having council. I know that, you know, obviously if you're, there's a standard exemption for school districts with only one school. I have a neighbor districts like that. Of course, it doesn't apply in my county, but I represent Kentucky's 6th judicial district, and there could be some school districts that do have exemptions. I'm just unaware, to be quite honest.
Now, there's one that comes to mind, and I'm going to see if Natasha Napier, my branch manager of District 180, is on. She may know that number right off the top of her head. Natasha, are you on?
I am on. We have around 10 districts who are still exempt because of the one school district status.
And how many schools are still exempt because of making meeting their annual goals, I should say?
We currently do not have any because of their achievement status.
Okay, that helps me understand that situation very much better. And I guess the follow-up to that, Dr. Foster, is did the former, since there's not any that now are exempt due to their achievement status, it probably eliminates the question for, did the former regulation require an annual submission of that exemption, or was it just a singular one time until they fell out of accountability measure?
And when you say former, are you referencing the one that we just repealed?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'm going to ask Natasha to join us again if she has an answer for that. I believe it was annual, but I don't want to speak out of turn.
It was annual, so if they fell out of status, or once they were back on target of meeting those achievement goals, then they would reapply. So, you know, they could have had a break in between being on that list or not on that exempt list.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. It doesn't apply in Harrison County. We are 100% SBDM management for our schools. So thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Any other questions? We'll proceed. Do I have a motion to approve the amendments to 701 KAR 5:100 guidelines for alternative models for school-based decision-making?
Danny Atkins, I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Atkins.
Kirk Biggerstaff, I'll make the second.
Thank you, Dr. Biggerstaff. There's a second. Let's do a roll call.
We continue to have issues with the cameras, and I believe that is an issue with Teams. So if you can just pause when you say your name, hopefully your camera will activate. Danny Atkins?
Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Biggerstaff?
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Tim Bobrowski?
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett?
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran?
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox?
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale?
Keith Hale, yes.
Sheila Mitchell?
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh?
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdell?
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
Russ Tilford?
Russ Tilford, yes.
Okay, all members have voted.
All right, next we will come back, and this should get us back on track. We would be looking at, this should be page 3 of your agenda, amendments to 702 KAR 3:060 procedures for payment of employees. This would be Ms. Robin Kinney and Matt Ross from the Office of Finance and Operations with the Kentucky Department of Education.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to be with you this morning. The action before you today is to take action on proposed amendments to 702 KAR 3:060. And the need to bring this before you today is to amend the regulation to bring it into conformity with changes made to the statute. The statute is KRS 157.395, and it was amended in the 2020 session. This does relate to national board certified teachers and the payment and reimbursement therefore. And essentially, the statute was changed in the 2020 session to provide for two cohorts of national board certified teachers. We have the first cohort as of July 14, 2000 through July 1st of 2020. And those national board certified teachers shall continue to receive an annual salary supplement of $2,000 for the life of their certificate. So for that cohort of teachers, things really don't change. KRS 157.395, as amended, however, created a second cohort of national board certified teachers. And those teachers that are certified after July 1st, 2020 shall receive an annual salary supplement for the life of the certificate in accordance with the amount appropriated by the General Assembly. So if the annual supplement amount by the General Assembly is less than $2,000, the local board may provide an additional supplement to get them up to the $2,000, but the local board is not required to do so. So that is the changes that were set forth in the statute, and we are bringing now the amendment to incorporate those changes to the statute.
I think we may have lost her for a second. This is Matt Ross. But yeah, I think she was about done, but it just is bringing the regulation into conformity with the statute. So if you have any questions, we're happy to take them.
Do we have any questions?
My apologies, I'm getting kicked off a little bit this morning.
All right, I think I've got us a solution for our meeting. Let's get through this one and then we'll get a plan of action, okay? So again, last call for questions. Hearing none, do I have a motion to approve the amendments to 702 KAR 3:060 procedure for payment of employees?
Harry Burchett, Harrison County. I'd like to make a motion that we approve the amendment to 702 KAR 3:060, and thank you, Ms. Kenny, and to your team.
Thank you.
We have a motion. Do I need a second?
David Raleigh, I'll second.
Okay. Roll call, please, Meredith.
Okay. Danny Atkins,
Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Biggerstaff,
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Tim Browski,
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett,
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox,
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale,
Keith Hale, yes.
Sheila Mitchell,
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdell,
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
Russ Tilford.
Russ Tilford, yes.
Chair, Todd Allen did say that we can pause the meeting and everyone can log off and log back in, and that might help with the Teams issues.
All right, we will entertain a short break in the meeting to address the technology issues with Teams, and then we will rejoin at 10:25. Okay, it looks like it's 10:27, so we're ready now to resume our meeting. Is everything good on KDE side?
I believe so. It does appear that we're having some issues with Teams across the board. So if you are having trouble with your camera, if you want to turn off incoming video, that sometimes helps. But other than that, we will proceed and hope that logging off and logging back in fixed the issue.
Okay, so now let's clarify where we were at. And again, as I do want to make sure that we're back on track, I do apologize for getting us off just a tad on the agenda. But let's make sure that we're all back on the same page. Meredith, where did we leave off at?
We should be on the amendment to 703 KAR 5225.
Okay, so this should be on the bottom of page 4. And this is Kelly Foster. Now, Kelly did not address that one. Is that correct?
No, this is a different one.
Different. Okay, gotcha. Okay,
I've
so
got
we'll
several
go.
today, but this is my last one. Last time you'll have to deal with me.
Okay, no problem. So we'll go ahead then, and it says this is an amendment to 703 KAR 5:225 continuous improvement planning for schools and districts. Dr. Kelly Foster.
Great, thank you. So what we're trying to do with this one is make some changes to the regulation once again to allow for some additional flexibility and to reduce the administrative burden for KDE, for local schools and districts by clarifying some language in the reg. And I can walk you through those changes. There's not a lot of those, but I think it just really fleshes everything out and makes it easier to follow along and remove some of the burden. So we'll take a look at the one and only slide that addresses those changes, and you can follow along in the reg if you want to. On page 3, we remove the name diagnostics to create added flexibility in the eProof platform. Also on page 3, adds language to ensure the regulation stays in compliance with federal funding requirements. On page 4, we've added language to add the English learner plan that we referenced earlier. And the very last one adds language that allows other state statutes or regulations to feed in the CSIP and CDIP, and that's on page 4. And so you can see the changes in there. The eProof platform is where the CSIPs and CDIPs are housed, and so we wanted to take the opportunity to make sure that we didn't have a title of a diagnostic in there actually listed. That would make things a little bit more complicated. We will make it a little bit easier and a little bit more flexibility for the requirements of what's in your CSIP and CDIP to align. Any questions on the changes in this reg? And this would be a one reading as well.
Okay, hearing no questions, do I have a motion to approve the amendments to 703 KAR 5:225 continuous improvement planning for schools and districts?
Chair, this is David Raleigh. I'll make a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Raleigh. Need a second?
Harry Burchett, Harrison County, I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Burchett. At this time, we'll have a roll call vote. Meredith, please.
Danny Atkins.
Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Biggerstaff.
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Tim Bobrowski.
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett.
Harry Burchett, yes.
Superintendent Burchett, if you can try to turn your camera off and on, let's see if that works. I saw you pop up for a second. Can you try your vote again?
Harry Burchett, I vote yes.
Perfect, thank you. Tom Cochran?
Mr. Cochran just said that his computer has died and he's trying to get back on as we speak.
Okay, perfect, thank you. David Cox? Keith Hale?
Keith Hale, yes.
Sheila Mitchell?
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh?
David Raleigh, yes.
Kelly Ransdell?
Kelly Ransdell, yes.
Russ Tilford?
Russ Tilford, yes.
Okay, Chair, all members present have voted.
Looks like David Cox has just added as long as Danny Adkins. Can we go back and check with those two, please?
Yes. Superintendent Cox, we are voting on the amendment to 703 KAR 5225.
David Cox, yes.
And Superintendent Cochran, did you join as well?
Yes, ma'am. Sorry about that. My computer died. It's Tom
No.
Cochran. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, now all members have voted.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you all.
All righty. All right, so now it looks like we're to the part of the agenda where we're moving to policy issues. Now, again, am I on the right track with everybody?
We have one more amendment, amendment to 707 KAR 1340.
Okay, so we're at the top there. We'll have one more amendment, and this will be procedural safeguards, and this is the second reading. This will be amendment to 707 KAR 1:340. And we have Ms. Greta Hilton with us today.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. To begin the conversation, I'm actually going to look to Todd Allen to provide some contextual information before we jump in and review the section by section changes that's proposed to the regulation.
Sure. Thank you and good morning. Thank you, Chair. As you all recall, this item was previously before LSAC in November for review and was scheduled to be on the KBE agenda in December for approval, but based on some concerns of LSAC, the state board deferred that matter for further review, which we were happy to conduct. And to begin our conversation, I think it's important for us to just, first of all, take a high-level look at exactly what this regulation amendment does. So the regulation that's before you is being amended to incorporate the prior written notice requirements, as they're known in federal regulation, that are set forth at 34 CFR 300-503. And that regulation is contained within the federal regulations in the subpart titled Procedural Safeguards, Due Process Procedures for Parents and Children. So that is, this provision is specifically designed to provide procedural protections to students and parents. IDEA, of course, is a state grant to states, and Kentucky is a participating state. As a condition of us receiving those IDEA funds, the state must implement policies that provide the same or greater protection to students with disabilities. Any less protections than those provided in federal law would jeopardize Kentucky's IDEA funding for the entire state. I think it's important also as we begin this discussion, so we're focused on the language that is in the regulation as well as those changes that have been requested to the agency that we've declined to make, to dispel some confusion and misunderstanding that's been circulated regarding this regulation, both to LSAC members in November as well as in advance of this meeting. So later on in the presentation, Associate Commissioner Hilton and her staff will discuss the specific language in the regulation. But one change that the agency was requested to make that we've declined to make is to specifically limit prior written notice to times when an ARC makes a decision. There's actually nothing in federal law that strictly limits prior written notice to when an ARC makes a decision. Prior written notice is required by federal law when a public agency proposes or refuses to initiate the change or change the identification, evaluation, educational placement, or provision of FAPE to a child. So I'll go over those four categories again: identification, evaluation, educational placement, or provision of FAPE. Those are big decisions that are made regarding a student with disabilities, and the prior written notice requirement in the federal law provides that parents have a right to written notice of those changes that are being made. Prior written notice is not required for removal. Neither the federal regulation nor the KDE regulation that's in front of you state that prior written notice would be required for removal. That language is very clear. We have seen some inaccurate assertions to districts that this reg is being amended as an opportunity for KDE to cite districts for noncompliance when they remove a student one time from the classroom, send that student to the principal's office. That's simply inaccurate. That is not supported by the plain language of the federal regulation or the plain language of the state regulation that is before you. A removal or a disciplinary removal is not the same thing as a change in placement. And recall that change in placement is one of those four categories that prior written notice touches on.
Removal and disciplinary removal are not defined in the federal regulation, nor are they defined in the regulation that's before the LSAC today for review. To the extent that districts seek any guidance on what is or what is not a disciplinary removal, the United States Department of Education issued guidance on that in 2016, and that's very helpful. We would point districts to that. There's also been some assertions around this amendment of this regulation that there's a lack of alignment with federal regulation or that KDE is somehow overreaching. Again, that is simply not supported by the plain language of either the federal regulation or the state regulation. Again, we were asked to make a change to the regulation that would strictly limit prior written notice to those times when an ARC makes a decision. But as I highlighted before, the federal regulation puts that burden on the public agency, and it does not condition it on times that an ARC makes a decision. The federal regulation is not so narrowly tailored to restrict prior written notice to only providing that notice when an ARC makes a decision. To ask the agency to narrowly tailor our state regulation in that way would ask us to limit the rights of parents that are provided in federal law to receive notice when those big decisions around those 4 areas that we talked about are made. And it would also, because we would be limiting parents' rights, jeopardize KDE's funding, IDA funding for the entire state. So with those kind of misunderstandings dispelled, I'll turn it over to Greta and her staff for a discussion on the changes that have been made to the regulation.
Thank you, Todd. So I really wanted to take just a moment to go through this, the proposed changes with you and talk about the differences in the sections now that we have provided some contextual information around the reason that we're making these changes. So to just provide you with a little bit of history, it became evident to us actually a little while ago that the regulations that were written in 2008, quite frankly, are not in line with the federal regulations around prior written notice. And I think that's where the confusion has come in. In Kentucky, we're doing the practice already. So it's already out there. Your districts are already doing this, and we do it through the use of the ARC meeting notice, which is the 7-day notice that your district's sending to parents prior to an ARC meeting. And then we follow up with a conference summary report following that ARC meeting. The conference summary report, if done correctly, satisfies the requirements of prior written notice. However, in Kentucky, many, many years ago, when the regs were written, prior written notice and ARC meeting notice was confused. And I believe that's still confusing for some. So we have this problem today of differentiating between the two. So the idea behind the changes that we're making is simply to delineate between the ARC meeting notice, which is the 7-day notice that you're providing to parents already, and the prior written notice, which in Kentucky can be satisfied by the conference summary report following the ARC. There's no additional paperwork, no additional hoops to jump through. It's simply to get our regulation in compliance with the federal regulation, and then allow districts, schools and districts to get their policies and procedures updated if need be. So in looking at the regulation, this is a big reg. 1340 is a huge reg that has 18 sections. And it's a bit confusing because it includes not only the procedural safeguards, but also the state complaint procedures, which is why I believe the misleading information has been presented, because it is all in the same reg. We are not tinkering with the state complaint procedures or the disciplinary sections. If you'll look at the regulation that's in your packet, sections 1 and 2 have no changes. Section 3 on line 9, ARC meeting, was added to the title. Line 11 was changed to say the ARC meeting notice shall be provided to the parents 7 days before an ARC meeting, rather than a meeting in which the LEA would do X. We also added these requirements for the 7-day meeting notice, which would include in that section for meetings concerning a safety issue or disciplinary change in placement due to a violation of the code of conduct. An LEA shall provide written notice to the parents at least 24 hours before an ARC meeting. This language was already in the regulation. We just moved it. So you've been operating from the same procedure since 2008. We added the language that says the meeting notice shall include the purpose, time, location, and who will attend. inform the parents of their ability to invite others who have expertise or knowledge of the child, and for a child beginning not later than the first IEP to be in effect when the child turns 16 or younger if determined by the ARC. The notice shall indicate the purpose and consideration of post-secondary goals and transition, an invitation to the student, and any other agency invited. If you look at the ARC meeting notice that's currently in Infinite Campus that your districts are using, it includes all of that information as it currently is. So then section 4 is the addition of prior written notice to parents. And again, if you can interchange conference summary and prior written notice to be synonyms, then this will help clarify that. So we added this section to say that the LEA shall provide written notice to the parents of a child with a disability within a reasonable time before the LEA implements any changes proposed or refused to the identification, evaluation, placement, or provision of FAPE, which were those 4 big areas that Mr. Allen spoke to a moment ago. In this section, this is where we moved the meeting notice about the 24 hours to a safety change. We moved it up to section 3. In section 5, there were no changes other than the renumbering. Section 6, we changed lowercase LEA to uppercase LEA, renumbered it to section 5, and updated the reference to other sections with correct numbering. Section 7 was renumbered, and we changed the term judge to court. In section 8, we renumbered it as well. We removed of from 2 lines to correct the typos, and we added KAR between 707 and chapter, so it would read 707 KAR chapter. In section 9, we renumbered it. Section 10, it was renumbered and renumbered the references within the section. Section 11 was renumbered and we removed a semicolon. Section 12, we added the word for and renumbered. Section 13, we renumbered and again corrected the numbered references within the section. Section 14, renumbered, corrected the numbered references within the section. Section 15, renumbered and corrected the reference sections within the section. 16 and 17 were the same thing. They were renumbered, and the numbers that referenced other sections within that section was, or those sections were updated. In section 18, the section that we discussed previously, and I don't believe there was any concerns about it, but it was simply to remove forms that were incorporated by reference so that we could ensure that when parents were filing due process or complaints, they mailed them to the appropriate address because it still said 500 Miro Street. And as you know, we've not been there for a while. So those are the updates, the proposed updates that we would like to make with this reg. And again, it aligns with the federal regulation 300-503 and essentially mirrors that language. The practice in which this will actually occur within your districts will be minimal to none because your directors of special education and other ARC chairs are already performing this. And keep in mind, we've also run this by local directors of special education, that advisory group, regional directors of special education and the cooperatives, and Kentucky Case actually discussed this in November, and there have been no concerns put forth. So, and also with me is David Wickersham, who is currently in the Office of Special Education and Early Learning, and I'm going to turn it over to him at this time to see if he has anything to add to that.
Thank you, Greta. I really do not. I would basically just go back to the fact that, as Todd recited earlier on, the purpose of the IDEA is to protect the rights of children with disabilities and their parents. And the Act is very explicit in setting out expectations, both for the state education agency and then also for districts. The State Department, KDE, is required must establish procedural safeguards, must ensure that all of our regulations conform to the IDEA, and also have a responsibility to ensure in smaller ways that public agencies, the local education agencies, are establishing and actually implementing procedural safeguards as contemplated both by the federal regs and then also by the state regulations. Preemption concerns, of course, mean that the federal law controls on this, that we do not have the authority or the ability to contradict what's in federal law. One idea that I think is sometimes considered is whether we might be able just to instead use the federal law rather than establishing procedural safeguards in Kentucky. Kentucky's administrative regulation rules and laws in Chapter 13A preclude or prohibit KDE from actually incorporating federal regulation by reference. So we don't have the ability to move those over into our procedures and into our regulations. So I think that's all I would add.
Thank you, David. So at this time, Chair, we will turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Hilton, and we appreciate the communication there that we've had so far in the presentation. It says at this point in time, we will discuss any issues or concerns from the body.
Chair Bobrowski, I have a couple of comments I'd like to say. Also.
Okay.
Sheila Mitchell from Anderson. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for all the hard work on the revisions made for the entire regulation, specifically to Section 3. We appreciate the safety ARC notice and the conversations around that was brought up in November being changed. So thank you for that. The continued concerns around what I think Mr. Allen indicated is really just around that prior written notice and what that interpretation is by KDE as well as within the school district. So Ms. Hilton, I think I heard you say that, and I just want to make sure that we're clear on this, is the prior written notice appropriately does come after the ARC, referencing the decisions made by the ARC. Is that correct? Am I interpreting what you said correctly?
The prior written notice would be required, the district is required to let the parents know of any proposed or refused action for identification, evaluation, placement, or the provision of FAPE. So there are 4 categories in which it's required. In Kentucky, we typically do that following an ARC. So before the action is implemented, the ARC conference summary would be sent to parents within a quote reasonable time, and that's the time frame laid out in the federal regulations. As I mentioned, from a practitioner's perspective, your districts are already doing that. KDE has trained that for a number of years. The regs simply didn't have the correct language to reflect what was occurring in practice.
Okay, so if we were able to help the school districts make sure that we're clarified on that, would there be any reason why we couldn't add in just a simple phrase to help us with that, to say notice is given before implementation of an ARC decision about proposed or refusal by the ARC? That way we all understand exactly what you just said is the intent of that piece of the regulation.
Superintendent Mitchell, I'll respond to that because I think that's related to what I noted earlier. The federal regulation provides for prior written notice to a parent anytime a district makes any of those 4 big decisions, regardless of whether it conducts an ARC meeting or not. So we'll take an example. Let's take identification as an example. If the district changes a student's identification under the IDEA and it fails to conduct an ARC meeting to do that, we know that would be a violation of ARC authority and other regulations, but the district must still send prior written notice to the parent to notify them that that change has been made. So I hope that that shows why it is that this prior written notice is not tied exclusively to an ARC decision. The district has an obligation to send that regardless of whether the ARC meets.
And that's the difference between just notifying the parent of the meeting notice and the prior written notice, correct?
That's right. They're 2 different types of notice.
Okay, so if we're able to clarify that in the language, I think all the superintendents and the special education directors would be satisfied with that piece. And I don't think that piece is in there, because that's where the water is muddied, and then goes even deeper into being muddied with the difference between the PBI strategies being determined as disciplinary removals and change in placements when they're really only temporary removals. And that's why that's so important for us to have that clarified, because only the ARC makes that decision on those removals. And so, that's why we want that piece clarified. How can we get that piece clarified so that we all feel better about that?
I'm going to go back to the federal regulation, which provides that districts have an obligation to provide prior written notice to a parent anytime it makes any of those 4 big decisions, regardless of whether they were made by the ARC or not.
Right.
So indicating in the state regulation that it's strictly tied to an ARC decision would be limiting the rights of parents that are provided in federal law. It would be diminishing the notice that's required to be provided to parents.
So you're saying that a change in placement includes recess and a lunch detention, and prior notice would need to be made for parents for that? Because those are the types of things that we're concerned about that has happened, which is the reason why the conversation is coming about regarding this piece of the regulation. That's our biggest concern.
Yeah, that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, the difference between a change in placement and a removal or a disciplinary removal. Those are not the same thing. So prior written notice is not required for removal or a disciplinary removal. I think what you're getting at is really what the definition of a removal or a disciplinary removal is, and that's not contained in this regulation. So
but it's impacted by what the prior written notice meaning is. And so that's why we're trying to get that piece clarified. So if we could just get that piece clarified within the regulation, I think we would all be comfortable with the understanding of the difference between the removal and the temporary removal.
Logically, I don't think that's doing what you're thinking that it's going to do. So if we play that out from a logical perspective, what you're asking to tie the prior written notice strictly to an ARC decision because of this concern around removal or disciplinary removal. The fear, as I understand it and have heard it, is that the state education agency is making a determination that a removal or a disciplinary removal has rose to the level of a change in placement. If the state education agency makes that determination, it's going to be a violation of the IDEA placement regulations, regardless of this clarification that you're asking being made. And it further, again, diminishes and limits the rights of parents to receive notice of those decisions being made.
Well, with the ARC being the only entity that can make that decision, I don't understand, and I guess I'm asking for the reasoning of why it can't be placed in this regulation piece to state that. Because
I think that goes.
We all know that the ARC is the only, the LEA ARC is the only entity that can make those changes.
But if a district does improperly make one of those changes outside of an ARC meeting, it must still provide written notice to the parent.
Okay, so the prior written notice then should be made for, and I keep asking the same question because what's happened to the school districts in the past is that they've been asked to enter NIC, the change, the temporary placement of recess being taken away or lunch detention, NIC. So therefore it would indicate that KDE was interpreting that as a disciplinary removal and a change in placement, when in fact you just said it was not, because the ARC would be the only place that could take place. So that's the confusion that continues to remain. The question is, how do we clarify that in this language to help us not have that misinterpretation between KDE and the school district? That's what we're after.
Right. So your question again goes back to what is and what is not a disciplinary removal. That's not provided in federal regulation. It's not provided in state regulation. It's provided in guidance. And that guidance exists and has existed since 2016.
And I think we agree on that. That's not what we're disagreeing on. We're all agreeing on that part of it. What we're disagreeing is that when this regulation passes, okay, KDE is still going to make interpretations of the differences between disciplinary removals, which could likely be lunch detention, it could likely be recess, and we're still going to be disagreeing on that area, and districts are going to be penalized. It's not that we don't want to protect children, because we do. We all want to protect our special needs children. We all agree that this is the purpose of this regulation, and we all agree that prior notice should be given. We all agree that all of that should happen. Where we disagree is that when districts are being penalized for doing PBIS, all these strategies that are good for children to help, they're being determined as disciplinary removals and a change in placement when they're not. So that's the reason why the concern is still being had over the revision of this, and specifically the timing of this.
So if I could jump in here just to provide a little background around removal and change of placement for students with disabilities and what's occurring at the department. And I do want to clear up the information that you just provided about lunch and recess not being part of the educational placement or instructional school day. Those are indeed part of the student's educational placement, and that's referenced in the Dear Colleague letter that's dated August 1st, 2016, that I believe you are familiar with. And it's also, removal is defined in the EdFax data submission from USED as any instance in which a student with disability is removed from his or her educational placement for disciplinary purposes. So if a student is removed from lunch, recess, math, whatever part of the educational placement, then that would be documented as a removal. However, that the change in this regulation won't change that. That's the process that we've been operating under. It's gone through, I did an EdCast for superintendents in 2019. At the time, didn't receive any complaints. We did 2 full rounds of consolidated monitoring with the focus on discipline. We have since then followed up with about 20-ish districts, training within districts on how to appropriately document removals and when do removals rise to the level of a change in placement. And that only occurs, a removal only comes up to a change in placement if a student has been removed for 10 consecutive days and there's a pattern of behavior. And
right.
so if you get to that place, where a student's been removed for 10 days or there's a pattern of behavior, then the ARC needs to meet. And obviously that's best practice for kids, even if, forget the legal part of it. That's the right thing to do for kids.
Right.
And at that time, if the ARC determines that the behavior is a manifestation of the student's disability, disciplinary measures need to be changed so that the student can have a free, appropriate public education. If it isn't a manifestation of the student's disability, then the district can discipline the student in accordance with the code of conduct, just as they would any other student. So it may or may not ever rise through change in placement. So I really think that this has been muddied so much that we've lost focus of what we're doing here today, which is simply simply amending our regulation so that it's in line with the federal regulation. The practices that are occurring within your districts aren't changing. But if you could point me to a page number and line within the regulation that you believe is problematic, then we're happy to look at that.
So it's section 4, and the difference is what you just said. We all agree on that, Greta. Where we disagree is that when districts are asked to document an IC, where when students are miss recess or have lunch detentions, where all of that counts toward that 10 days. That's where districts are being penalized and where we're trying to do what is right by students. So that's what needs to be clarified in that section 4.
That doesn't really have anything to do with section 4. The disciplinary provisions of this regulation are on down in section 13 or 14.
Okay, so the difference
4 isn't discipline.
So the disciplinary removals and the change in placement is not in section 4?
No. Section 4 is prior written notice, and it states that an LEA shall provide written notice to the parents of a child with a disability within a reasonable time before the LEA implements a proposal to initiate or change the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of the child or the provision of FAPE to the child, or B, refuses to initiate or change the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of the child or the provision of FAPE to the child. And then it goes on to discuss the notice.
So if it goes over the threshold, then it becomes an issue in section 4. And that's part of the issue that we're having, because when even if there's not a determination by an ARC, districts are still being penalized for doing those things and being asked to document them in IC, which then would be considered a disciplinary removal and a change in placement. And that's all we're after. It's just the clarification between those two things and a temporary removal. And to be able to do that, it would be, you could determine that by adding the one line in there that the ARC is, that the notice is given before the implementation of the ARC for the decision for the proposal or the refusal of the action.
I'm sharing my screen now that compares the federal regulation with the proposed state regulation before you, so you can clearly see that the federal regulation speaks nowhere to tying prior written notice to strictly an ARC decision. It just talks about action by a public agency. So again, I'll go back to the fact that if we in Kentucky strictly tie prior written notice to an ARC decision, that diminishes the rights of parents to receive written notice that is clearly provided in federal law. KDE cannot do that because it would diminish those parent rights and jeopardize our state IDEA grant. I think, Superintendent Mitchell, what you're asking for is more along the lines of guidance on this topic.
I'm not asking for guidance at all, because I clearly understand it. What I'm asking for is a very clearly defined line in the regulation that allows the understanding to be made that the ARC is the LEA that is referenced in the federal regulation that you just provided that does make the decision. That's what we're asking for.
Yeah, I think we have explained why it is that the agency isn't able to make that change that you're asking for, because that would diminish, again, the rights that are provided to parents that are clearly stated in federal law.
The other issue, if I may, is that federal law actually defines public agency. 34 CFR 300.33 defines public agency as including LEAs, but does not explicitly mention IEP teams or ARCs. So because public agency is defined in federal law, and the prior written notice provisions that Todd has on the screen now refer to prior notice by the public agency, we think that we're accurately capturing the intent of the IDEA and complying and comporting with that as we're required to by federal law by limiting that prior notice to a notice being made by the public agency that's defined in federal law.
The ARC makes the decision, so the ARC is the LEA, is defined for the process for determining eligibility of a student. So we all understand that piece of it. The difference is where the interpretation falls of the disciplinary removal, the change in placement, and how it's handled at KDE versus a temporary removal. That's the difference. And I think every superintendent understands that.
Superintendent Mitchell, do you have an example of a time in which KDE cited a district for failing to provide prior written notice when due to a placement decision that was a result of removals?
That is not my job, Ms. Hilton, to collect, all of the violations or, things that take place across the state in special education violations. I do not. I have heard of several concerns across the state of overreaching and overstepping for this specific concern that I've brought about, specifically around calculating and counting lunch detentions, recess, toward the 10 days. I know that that has taken place and has happened across the state in multiple school districts. That's the example that I've provided several times throughout my bringing up concerns. You know, those are the examples that I have to provide you.
So, and I appreciate that. I appreciate you bringing this up. I honestly, I can't think of a time that we have cited a district for failing to provide prior written notice due to a change in placement as a result of disciplinary removals. You are accurate that we have been providing ongoing guidance and monitoring around disciplinary removals, which again, comparing these two things is kind of like comparing apples and oranges. They are not the same. And so, you know, in looking at, and I understand the frustration around lunch and recess, but quite frankly, those are not privileges. Those are part of a student's educational placement that's defined in the August 1, 2016 Dear Colleague letter from the U.S. Department of Education. And it's also defined in an email from OSEP, because when this first came up a few years ago, from a person, I actually reached out to the Office of Special Education Programs at USED and said, tell us if we're wrong. Does lunch, recess, all of those things, are they included in a student's educational placement? And I received a response from USED that they are indeed part of the educational placement and should be documented as removals anytime a student with a disability is removed from those. So what I would encourage you to think about then is the reason for that is, just as Mr. Allen mentioned, that it's about providing safeguards and protections to students with disabilities. We know, and there's data to support, and it's in that August 1 letter, that students with disabilities are disproportionately removed from the classroom, particularly students of color with disabilities are even more so disproportionately removed from the classroom. Failing to document those removals, whether it be in lunch or recess or snack time or any of those things that could be perceived as privileges, which actually are indeed part of the educational placement of a student, which is part of a student's fate. But failing to document those could result in students missing many hours of his or her appropriate educational placement. So my office has simply said, this is the guidance from OSEP. We would expect school districts to afford students with disabilities these protections and entitlements for which they are frankly entitled to, and document that. It's simply documentation. Should it rise to the level of a change of placement, I can't imagine a district wouldn't want to know that and wouldn't want to ensure that a parent was informed of that change in a student's educational placement. And I feel strongly that all of you would agree with me that you certainly would want to know. And the only way that you can know is if you have appropriately documented that.
So what you're suggesting is that if a school district uses lunch detention or recess, that needs to be approved or made in an ARC decision as an appropriate strategy, a PBS appropriate strategy for the child. Is that what you're suggesting? Therefore, it would not be a temporary, or excuse me, it wouldn't be a disciplinary removal. It would be a temporary removal.
No, that's not what I said. But 2 points that I'd like to clarify on what you just said. It would be a temporary removal, but temporary removals in and of themselves do not spark prior written notice. And 2, a removal is not an appropriate positive behavior intervention or support. That's not a PBI strategy. But in that line of thinking, any type of positive behavioral intervention or strategy, or anything written into the student's IEP that the student may need, which might include de-escalation. It might include, student-initiated timeouts. It might include, quiet time. Those types of things are not removals if it's entered into a student's IEP as an appropriate intervention or support. And we have trained that. We've been very clear in my office that those things are not removals. We want students to be afforded the opportunity to catch their breath, so to speak. But on the other side of that, when students are removed because in a removal would be when a disciplinary event has occurred and that child is taken out of his or her typical environment. So if as a consequence, not as an IP strategy, not as PBIS, not as, any of those de-escalation strategies, if you send a child in detention, whether it be for lunch, reading, math, whatever part of the day, that's a removal. But again, that may not spark prior written notice, which is what we're talking about today.
We understand that, and we agree that the disagreement comes in that we have to notify a parent if a recess or a lunch detention, because then it becomes a disciplinary removal. We're going to disagree on that. So
I don't think
once again, the regulation does not provide for prior written notice for a disciplinary removal. It's only a change in placement.
But the interpretation from KDE is that a lunch detention is. So
a lunch detention is, and it's not the interpretation of KDE. It's the interpretation of USAID. I can provide you with that language if that would be helpful.
And so is a recess, Greta?
Yes. And I will provide you with the language, the Dear Colleague letter, as well as the email from OSEP, because we reached out to ensure that we were indeed on the right track.
That's where we differ. Chairman, that's all I have.
Okay, other questions, concerns from the group? Sounds like somebody was trying to chime in. Any clarification? Ms. Mitchell, I want to thank you for your concerns that was expressed, and Ms. Hilton, I know there's some disagreements there that we have between both groups of individuals, and I know it sounds like it's a touchy situation, but it's probably a clarification point and an interpretation. And again, I think understanding the interpretation is, where most superintendents I think would be at, as well as special ed directors across the state, is everybody wants to be in compliance, and I don't think anybody wants to be caught in a position in which we're not in compliance with obviously meeting special needs concerns as well. And of course, I've mentioned you mine personally as a superintendent, and I respect that fact that we're looking out for kids, but it's a logistical issue, it sounds like, at this point. So I'm really at a kind of a loss between what to do at this point. I know we do have some concerns, and we do appreciate the concerns being somewhat modified there from November. But at this point, as chair, I don't know what else we can do. We've expressed the concerns. I think the concerns will be noted in the minutes as they provide forward to the Kentucky Board of Education to consider. They ultimately will make the final call on the process, and I think we're all aware of that.
Chairman, I have a suggestion. If we make the motion to approve the regulation as written with one addition, which is the notice is given before implementation of ARC decision about proposal or refusal by the ARC. I think that clearly defines the concern from me. I'm not sure if it defines the concern from the entire body, but that is my concern and that is my motion.
Okay. So we do have a motion by Ms. Mitchell. We will need a second.
Kelly Ransdell, second.
Okay. Ms. Ransdell, thank you for the second. So we do have a motion and a second. Ms. Meredith, I will ask that you proceed with a roll call, please.
Mr. Bobrowski?
Yes.
Superintendent Bobrowski, I'm sorry, I'm working remotely, so I'll keep my video off because my connection is not strong. Is there an opportunity for discussion before the group votes on this motion?
We already had that, Commissioner, as an open item there for discussion, and Ms. Mitchell had an opportunity to express her concerns, as well as the other superintendents who were asked if they had other concerns as well.
Yes, yes, Mr. Chair, I listened in to that exchange. I think you have a specific motion now, and I'm asking if there's an opportunity to discuss the specific motion.
Okay, thank you for the clarification. Any discussion about the motion?
Yes, I would begin by saying I appreciate the dialogue, Mr. Chair. We've done our best to lay out what's in the federal law, how the proposed regulatory changes that KDE is bringing forth bring us into alignment with the federal law. We've outlined what's required for prior written notice, those 4 areas of identification, evaluation, placement, and FAPE that are identified in IDEA. And we've also spoken about why the Kentucky Department of Education will not move forward with any regulations that tie the prior written notice only to ARC decisions. And we have also stated that that there is a difference between an IDEA, one of those IDEA 4 category decisions, and a disciplinary action, that a disciplinary action that's temporary in nature does not constitute a change in placement. We can put guidance out that clarifies that last point, that we don't consider a disciplinary action to be a change in placement for a student. As Ms. Hilton indicated, we're not aware of any district that's been cited for that specific issue, but we can clarify that in guidance. But what the motion that is before you, you're welcome, the group is welcome to vote on it however they want, but I will not move forward with a recommendation to the state board that we put something into state regulation that we know restricts the rights of parents and students beyond what is in IDEA. So I just wanted to clearly make that known as the superintendents make their determination. As far as process, Mr. Chair, I think once the group makes its vote on this, the LSAC can decide if it wants to support or not support, or in this case, ask for a substitution to it. We will certainly take that to the State Board of Education. You'll be provided the opportunity as the LSAC to state your rationale for why you think the State Board should make that change. We will also provide a rationale in this case, if this motion is successful, as to why we do not think that the State Board should make that determination. And then ultimately, it'll be up to the State Board to decide which direction it wants to go. So we defer to them as the final decision-making authority, but you will have the opportunity based on this motion to make a recommendation, and the department will also make a recommendation. So those are my comments on the proposed motion, Mr. Chair, and I'll turn things back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Glass, for your comments. Any other comments from the body or from the group?
Chairman Bobrowski, I have one final comment, and that is, I think we all agree that the ARC makes the final determination and change in placement and disciplinary removal. So I think with that being understood, it absolutely does not limit the student or the parent, which I think we all agree that we don't want to limit the student and or the parent. So just to make a clarification on that note, in response to Commissioner Glass's comment.
Okay. Well noted.
Chair Bobrowski?
Yes.
I guess I've been sitting here listening to the dialogue and trying to digest the conversation, in referring back to something that Mr. Allen said with regard to the 4 areas of the identification, the evaluation, the educational placement, and the provision of FAPE. And knowing that all school districts and all superintendents know that, and it is the law that we have an ARC that makes those determinations, and that's where that occurs. I guess I'm just still struggling with the notion that any LEA would have in place a situation where one of those changes occurs outside of an ARC and would not have a prior written notice of the findings of the ARC or the action being taken by the ARC. So it's a confusing situation. I'm struggling with that, but I appreciate all the dialogue and all the input by all parties. It's hard for me to believe, knowing that what we're all here for is about all kids, all students, and what is best for all students, certainly our special needs population, as well as all students, that any district or any LEA would make a decision that is not in compliant with law. And it may have unintentionally occurred somewhere at some point in time, but I can't believe that anyone would intentionally take such action, and then there would not be prior written notice. So it's just confusing to me. The two facets of this makes it a very confusing situation. So thank you. My comments.
Chair, I can respond to that briefly if you'd like. Superintendent Burchett, I think you do an excellent job of highlighting the exact issue that we've talked about. That unintentional time that a district may make one of those decisions, even unintentionally, the federal law provides safeguards to the parent that the district must send them notice that that decision has been made. So that's the reason that the agency has refused to make the change that strictly ties this to an ARC decision, which is what's on the table for y'all's motion right now. So I think you highlight a perfect example. The federal law provides that if a district does make a mistake and unintentionally makes a change in one of those 4 areas, it still must provide written notice to the parent of the change that it made.
And if
I guess, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I was just going to say, if I could add to that, I took the liberty of looking at your websites and looking at your special education policies to determine if this would be a heavy lift to make some changes within your district. And I wasn't able to look at all of them, but of those that I did see, local policies, while they're out of alignment with the federal regulations, and I think that's because the Kentucky administrative regulations are out of alignment because they mirror ours as you would expect them to. Your district policies, for the most part, put the burden of notifying the parent on the district. So it's not going to be a change from what you're already doing. A couple of examples, I did look at Anderson counties, and I did see Lyon counties, and those were on there. I looked at Anchorage; those were completely in line with the federal regulations. So I think for the most part, you're doing exactly what we're asking you to do, and I think that's where we're getting turned sideways a little bit, and that's why I mentioned that point, because I think understanding that the policies are only going to have to change enough so that they mirror the update in our policies, which will mirror the federal regs, so that the SEA and LEAs are in compliance. But looking at your policies, you've already placed the burden of notice on the district and not the ARC. So you've done that appropriately, and all that to say it's not going to be a heavy lift to change things within your district.
Yeah, this is Kirk Biggerstaff. I just wanted to kind of get some clarification here as well. Like, I think what KDE is saying is that the current motion tying it to the ARC, are you all saying, Todd, are you saying that that's probably not going to pass legal guidelines?
That's right, Dr. Biggerstaff. I could not recommend that to the state board to adopt a regulation that changed with that change in it, because it would not be aligned with the federal regulation.
But then I think I heard from the commissioner that he's willing to give guidance on that as well. Superintendent Mitchell, how would you feel about that?
I feel that I have 2 other attorneys that disagree.
Okay.
And, they're both attorneys are very experienced, and I trust their guidance that they've provided. I think we all agree that the ARC is the determining entity that makes the final decisions on the 4 areas. And I agree with you, Greta, that we are all in compliance. Where we disagree is on that temporary removal and how that's handled, and why districts are being penalized for those actions.
Just to follow up, Mr. Chair, As Todd indicated, we will have conflicting recommendations that move forward to the state board if this motion were to pass. We are willing to work on clarifying guidance on this issue and on the disciplinary action, a temporary disciplinary action, not leading to a change in placement, and providing information on that. The attorneys who may be advising Ms. Mitchell ostensibly are representing the interest of districts in this process, but the Department of Education has a responsibility to also look after the interest of parents and students in this process. And so for that reason, and because we in good conscience cannot advise the board to do something that puts our regulations in conflict with federal law, for those reasons, we would not be moving forward with the recommendations as moved.
I just have to respond to
This
that.
is Kelly Ransdell. I seconded the motion, but I'm willing to consider KDE's motion accompanied by guidance for districts that may already be out there, but to redistribute that differentiates between repeated removal and the situations that we've been talking about, and instances of removal that are not repeated, that are for safety, when students must be removed from situations like lunch that Sheila discussed.
I think from a procedural standpoint, Mr. Chair, you've got a motion and a second that's out, so that either has to be withdrawn or voted on to close that motion out, and then another motion can then be put forward that reflects what Ms. Ransdell just indicated.
Okay, are there any other discussions before we progress?
Okay. Just to Superintendent Ransdell's comment about the guidance, I just want to say my office is happy to delve into that guidance immediately, with or without a motion. We will certainly do that because we've clearly noticed that there's some confusion out there, misunderstanding. So, I can pledge to you that we will begin working on guidance with or without a motion, just to ensure that everyone's clear on this. And I appreciate the conversation. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And as we've all talked about, we do have to figure out how we're going to progress through today's meeting. So we do have a motion on the floor by Ms. Mitchell, which was originated earlier. And let's see, we probably need a little, because we've had several conversations, Ms. Mitchell, I guess we would need to have a clarification of that motion. And then we would look to the second, as it appears that Ms. Ransdell has withdrawn her second of that motion.
My motion still stands. It stands as that I approve it based upon one line added in that just clarifies that the implementation of the ARC, makes a decision or refutes a decision proposed in the ARC.
Okay.
So, Chair Bobrowski, just from a procedural standpoint, I think it's unusual, but if we've had a motion, the second on the motion has been withdrawn, then a vote can't be taken on it unless someone else now is willing to second. But I've honestly never had this happen before, so we may need some legal advice. But I think we do need a motion seconded before a vote can be taken.
I would agree, and that's where we're at now with making sure we all understand the first motion, because we do not. We want to clarify first, and then we'll look for a second on that motion. If we don't have a second, then we'll have to go back for a motion. Is the way I understand the procedural guidelines. If I'm wrong, please indicate.
I think you've got it right, Superintendent Bobrowski.
Thank you. So we will need to have a second for Ms. Sheila Mitchell's motion. not hearing a second. Procedurally speaking, Mr. Allen, how would you recommend that we proceed at this point?
So if there's not a second on the motion, then the motion fails.
Okay.
As chair, you can now consider other motions that may be made.
Okay. So we will now look for another motion to be entertained at this time. This would also be, I do want to remind that this motion is reflective of our discussion. So if we will entertain a motion at this time.
I have a question, Tim.
Yes, go ahead.
So, looking back at my notes, we had the first reading on this July of 2020. I mean, we're coming up on, by the time we begin, we're coming up on like a year with this thing. So, I guess my question is, if we don't make a motion to approve something today, I mean, Dr. Glass, will you be taking it to the Board of Education anyway? Because I would imagine that something needs to be taking place to move this process along.
Yeah, thank you, Superintendent Raleigh. As far as I know, there's nothing that compels the LSAC to take a position on these. And I'd look to Todd to verify that that's accurate. But I believe you can vote to support the recommendation support the regulation that's before you. You can vote to amend it, which is what we were talking about, and some different ways to do that, or put something with it. There was a suggestion around an amendment to it, and then Ms. Ransdell talked about asking for guidance along with it. So that's an option. You could vote to oppose it, or you could take no action on it. So I think it's that last part that I would look to our counsel, Todd Allen, on here to inform you if LSAC simply taking no action was one of the paths before you. And it would be to be direct on your question, Mr. Raleigh, what we would do, just given the amount of time and work that we've done to clarify this, to take feedback into account, to shape it, to vet it, to hear concerns and comments and continue to make adjustments to it. We would be taking forward this regulation to the state board with our recommendation that they approve it. If there is no action taken by LSAC today. But Todd, I would ask, go ahead.
Yeah, Commissioner, I think you're right on point there. The statute providing for LSAC provides that they have the ability to review all of the regulations that the state board will consider and provide any advice. Obviously, it's an advisory council, so to provide feedback and advice. If the LSAC doesn't take any action, even though they've had an opportunity to review it, then it can still go before the state board for action.
So then again, I think, Mr. Chair, the floor is open for motions to approve, motions to amend, motions to approve with a statement around guidance, or motions to not support or not approve. Or if there are no motions, then the LSAC has simply taken no action and we move forward.
Okay, so we will proceed under that direction. I'll open the floor for any motion pertaining to the 707 KAR 1:340 procedural safeguards, which is the second reading.
Chair Bobrowski, I have a follow-up question for Council Allen, if I can.
Go ahead.
Mr. Allen, has the review of the regulation by you or your team at KDE, has it extended beyond legal counsel at KDE to other entities, for example, legal authorities over at LRC or KSBA counsel or any other counsel?
Thank you for the question, Superintendent Burchett. We provide all of the materials that are provided to LSAC, to OEA. They're also an entity that reviews and has the ability to provide feedback on all of the regulations. So they have been provided to OEA, which is an arm of the legislature, and we haven't heard any feedback from them on that. I'm not aware of any feedback from KSBA. I don't believe that they get the regulations other than just seeing them published with public notice, the same way that they go out to LSAC and to the state board, but they haven't contacted us with any concerns.
So I guess as a follow-up, OEA, you say it was shared with OEA, but they've not weighed in on this particular regulation or the other regulations considered today?
That's right. We share all of our regulations with them because they have the ability, like LSAC, to review and provide advice on all of those, and they have not weighed in on this.
I suppose where there's been some disparity in, of course, we all know that the saying that, you could ask the same question to 10 different attorneys and get 10 different opinions. And, that's a part of I guess, the varying views and expert lens by which attorneys look at these things. So I'm just curious if in some of these regulatory requirements that are very, very, I guess, concerning or contentious in some areas, if there is a panel or I know that there are many attorneys, school law attorneys, that support many school districts. So they almost are, even though Kentucky doesn't specialize in practice of law, there are those that are experts in school law and federal law with regards to schools. And I'm just curious if there was a way when we get to these kind of things, like Mr. Raleigh said, we've been dealing with this since July. If there was a panel or an expert panel of attorneys that could be consulted on these kind of things, so that we make sure we get these things right, because we are here for all children, all students, and we want to make sure that we do our due diligence in recommending regulations that protect all students. And so I'm just curious if that was a possibility, or if that had ever been considered.
Absolutely. That type of panel does not currently exist, but it's a great suggestion.
Okay, I think we're to the point of moving forward and deciding as to how we're going to progress as a LSAC committee. So at this time, I will entertain a motion for the second reading to approve as presented. I will then follow up with a motion to approve the second reading with amendments. And then I will also entertain for no action to be taken by this committee on this particular topic. Now that's kind of how I think we should move forward as chairman to progress through this. So at this point in time, we'll have the motion, just procedurally speaking. Then I will ask for approval with amendments, and then I will follow up with no action to be taken. Hearing none, I think we're to the point of no action to be taken by the LSAC committee on this particular topic, unless anyone has the last option.
I'll make a motion that, that no action, will be taken by the LSAC on this particular topic, with a recommendation that, the Board of Education, consult, just what I think Mr. Allen said, that there's a good idea to have a panel or a panel of expert attorneys, that the Board of Education maybe consider a review by a larger body of legal minds and authority. I don't know if that made sense or not, but I hope you understand what I was trying to say.
Well, you did what I asked, and that was to get a motion on the floor for no action, but it kind of sounded like that the action was still in that motion, so I don't know how you want to proceed with that. Or just put a motion out on the floor with the recommendation, let somebody second it, and we'll move forward. That could be your motion, a motion of no action taken by the LSAC to amend 707 KAR 1:340 procedural safeguards, no actions on the second reading, but would put a request in there for what you just stated. God, you guys are making this tough on me. I'm telling you, I don't know how to stress.
This is Keith Hale. I'll second that, and I appreciate the additional guidance that is coming as well.
Okay. So we have a motion to be reflected as such, and then we have Keith Hale has made a second. Ms. Meredith, I will need a roll call, please.
Danny Atkins,
Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Bickerstaff,
Kirk Bickerstaff, yes.
Tim Bobrowski,
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett,
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox,
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale,
Keith Hale, yes.
Sheila Mitchell,
I abstain.
David Raleigh.
Yeah, I don't mean to be the big ship that's in the Suarez Canal, but could somebody, before I vote yes or no, to just let me know what I'm saying yes or no to again, please? I'm confused.
I'll be glad to. You're putting a motion forward on you're voting on the motion that was presented to take no action,
Okay.
but with a recommendation to have a panel, as was suggested in the first motion, to follow up and provide guidance. Now, if I missed that, please clarify, Ms. Meredith.
I believe so, and I believe Superintendent Burchett wanted that to be a panel of attorneys to look at the guidance, as well as the guidance that Associate Commissioner Hilton plans to provide on removal anyway. So that will happen regardless of this motion.
Okay.
Yes, just to clarify that we are recommending to the state board, we're taking no action on this particular amendment, but we are recommending that they consider a panel of legal experts from across the state to review this. And we've heard today that there's been numerous attorneys look at this, and there's conflicting information about what the federal regulation requires and what it does not require. And we need to get this thing right because it is about all kids. So that was my motion. Thank you, Dr. Brewer.
Okay, Dr. Brewer, with that being said, I vote yes. And could you please, because I try to keep notes on this so that I can provide a communication with our co-op, but if you could just send me a little snippet of what we voted on, I would greatly appreciate that.
Happy to do so.
Thank you.
Kelly Ransdell,
I vote yes. Kelly Ransdell, yes.
Russ Tilford,
Russ Tilford, yes.
okay, all members have voted.
Okay, moving on to policy issues. Approval of amended federal Perkins performance goals with David Horstman and Kylie Whitaker from the Office of Career and Technical Education from the Kentucky Department of Education.
Chair Rouse, Kelly Ransdell, I'm sorry, but I'm going going to have to leave the meeting for another commitment, but I have another meeting that's here.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Ransdale, for your attendance today. We appreciate your input, and we appreciate you around the table for these discussions. We will still have a quorum, so I would assume we could continue on. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, we can continue.
Okay. Have a good day, Mr. Ransdale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We're here to discuss and receive approval for revision of the performance goals for the Perkins 5 Act in light of what's happened in the past year with COVID-19 pandemic interruptions. I would say that your staff note discusses the core indicators and the fact that if performance levels are not met, the state would need to prepare a corrective action plan. And once you enter that corrective action plan, there's no means to revise those performance levels. So what we were looking at in January was we had no idea where we would be with our local school districts and how that we would be able to move toward meeting these performance levels. So the Federal Office of Career, Technical and Adult Education allows the states to amend these levels as long as their performance levels are met, and we were in that position at that time. So we want to make sure with the impact on our CTE enrollments and those opportunities for in-person activities, we felt like that we could amend and we should amend to protect the funding that comes to the state of Kentucky for career and technical education. And as it states in our staff note, we've also discussed this with our office data and leadership folks and with KCTCS to make sure that these were made in the best interest of everyone. So after that consultation, we let it out for public comment, and I believe Leslie Slaughter's on, but I believe that closes on Friday. And as yet, we have not had any comment from the public posing any opposition to these updates on these performance goals. If you have any questions, I have Kylie Whitaker from our office and Carla Tipton, who can speak to the data or the policy and legal part of what we're asking for today. So with that, I'll leave it to you for questions.
Any questions for Mr. Horstman and his staff? I do appreciate them all being in attendance today to answer any questions from superintendents.
Mr. Horstman, is this one of those things where it's a first and only reading today?
Yes, sir, that would be the case. I'm sorry.
That's all right. Thank you.
Before we jump in, it doesn't pertain necessarily to this, but again, I'll just make a kind of a general statement that with what we're seeing now, we all know with the recent passage of some movement that'll allow kids to stay back next year. Do you all have a position yet on what that would mean to like your all's programs, and then also what it could mean to like local high schools, for example?
Well, I can tell you that the department is working on guidance around that bill that is passed, and I think we're supposed to have that finalized today. I'm not sure if Meredith wants to handle that or Leslie. From our perspective, we know that there are some federal guidelines that determine the funding based on whether a student is graduated or not. So we're still kind of bouncing that around to let something official come out from the department, I believe tomorrow. We have a closed business of this afternoon for everyone to finalize that guidance, but you should see that coming in the next day or so.
Okay.
David, just to clarify, that the guidance, I think the internal feedback is this week, David, and then it's released to districts next Monday. So that was in the Monday minute to everybody. So that's the process. So we're working through it. And I just want to state this wasn't our idea. So, but we're working on it.
My apologies, Commissioner. Mr. Chair, I just want to say that we have reached out to the Federal Office of Career and Technical Education to get some answers around Senate Bill 128, as well as to some expert lawyers around Perkins, just to make sure that we are in compliance and know exactly how to move forward and provide the right guidance to school districts for this. So just wanted you to know that.
Okay. Thank you very much. We appreciate that, and we appreciate the timeliness that you guys are operating within from your department and your organization there within KDE. Just as a comment, I'll say, and nothing more before we jump into a vote. We're going into some new territory, but yet we know that a lot of our seniors, for example, that decide they want to stay back, it's really about placement. It's about completers. It's about getting them finished up and or moving forward. So I hope that whatever guidance comes out will make schools around the state, especially those that don't have a vocational technical school in their own back door, that services will be provided and rendered to those students, our students as well. So thank you all for that. Let's go ahead and do I have a motion to approve all the amended federal Perkins performance goals?
Chairman, this is Russ Tilford. I'll move that we approve the amended federal Perkins goals.
Thank you, Mr. Tilford. I will need a second.
Danny Atkins, I'll second.
Thank you, Mr. Atkins. We have a second. At this time, we'll have a roll call vote. Meredith.
Danny Atkins.
Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Biggerstaff.
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Tim Bobrowski.
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett.
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran.
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox.
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale.
Keith Hale, yes.
Sheila Mitchell.
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh.
David Raleigh, yes.
Russ Tilford.
Russ Tilford, yes.
Okay, Chair, all members have voted.
Okay. So at this point, making sure I'm on the right page, looks like we're over to approval of Kentucky minimum specification for school buses. And we have Mr. Che Ritter, and I know you got to help me here. I don't want to mispronounce names, but is it Elisa?
Elisa, yeah.
Elisa, okay, thank you. Hanley from the Office of Finance Operations from the Kentucky Department of Education.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to try to turn my video on here for a second and see if this works okay. There is I believe, just some minor changes to the specifications. You'll see some updates to the year on the, and the commissioner's name, of course, since Commissioner Glass is new. The other change, and Alyssa can provide a little more background on this, is we've changed some numbers from, like, on one bus it's 66 to an 84 passenger bus. Corrected a misspelling, some very minor changes, added Detroit engines as an option. And now all buses and components have a 5-year warranty, and that's on page 58. So it goes from a 2-year to a 5-year warranty. But I believe Alyssa told me this was like the smallest batch of changes that we've ever had on the bus specifications. Is that correct, Alyssa?
That is correct. And we actually were, the 66 to 88 is actually going from adding the option of 66 passengers. Some districts wanted to have the smaller buses available to them.
And I can confirm that because we just ordered 2 buses. First time we've ordered buses in forever. But, you know, the larger buses do make it a little more difficult to get up in some of the terrain that we have to travel. So I do appreciate that. And I really do like the extended warranty from 2 to 5 years. That's also a plus there for all of our transportation folks as well. So at this point, do I have a motion to approve the Kentucky minimum specifications for school buses in Kentucky?
This is Kirk Biggerstaff. I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Dr. Biggerstaff. Need a second, please?
Tom Cochran, I'll second that motion.
All right, thank you, Tom. At this time, we'll have a roll call vote. Meredith.
Danny Atkins,
Danny Atkins, yes.
Kirk Biggerstaff,
Kirk Biggerstaff, yes.
Tim Bobrowski,
Tim Bobrowski, yes.
Harry Burchett,
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox,
David Cox, yes.
Keith Hale,
Keith Hale, yes.
Sheila Mitchell,
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Russ Tilford.
Russ Tilford, yes.
Okay, Chair, all members have voted.
Thank you. At this time, we'll welcome Dr. Thomas Wood Tucker, Deputy Commissioner and Chief Equity Officer, to share an update on the KDE's Equity Playbook. There will be no vote required. This is an FYI.
Thanks, Chair, and certainly appreciate all members of LSAC for your thoughtful deliberation on important issues impacting students in the Commonwealth. I only have 2 minutes that Meredith gave me, and I'll be very quick here. First, we want you to know that very shortly we will be sending guidance out to our superintendents, our local school districts, so that you can continue to prepare for student learning and acceleration for this summer and beyond. And the second thing deals with the equity playbook. Many of you know from previous conversations that we are building an equity dashboard that's going to be an option, that's going to be a service, I should say, that's free to each one of you to use. And the equity dashboard, as you know, will have various metrics. It'll have data, but we want to go beyond that. We want to create an equity playbook, and we're working with the company to create this equity playbook to address the data, some of the deficiencies that you may find in the data or discrepancies you may find in your data in your various districts. And we want to hear from you. We want to come back in the near future to get your input on this playbook. The playbook will cover a few things: academic achievement, disproportionality, what we talked about earlier when we began to look at IEPs and so forth, high quality programming, distribution of funding and resources, and lastly, school culture and climate. We want to get your input on this and provide districts with at least one equity playbook. And that's it for me. And I will add that I will be asking Dr. Sweeney to reach out to Commissioner Glass's Counseling Advisory Committee to present this equity playbook to them for their feedback as well.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Woods Tucker. We appreciate the information on equity today. We all value the importance. We do always want to remember in terms of an equity issue, it sounded like finances was a part of it. We also heard that it sounded like from the previous conversation that we're looking at our socioeconomic status of our students across the boards. And we look forward to that guidance coming out, and we'll be able to take a look at it and provide feedback. We do appreciate that very much. So thank you.
Thank you for the time, Chair.
Okay. This time we'll move to item 3, questions and answers.
Could I ask Dr. Woods Tucker a quick question? Yep. This won't take long.
No.
First of all, thank you for all the help that you provided our district in terms of our planning for equity, diversity, and inclusion. But I had a quick question. I've got a meeting scheduled with Panorama this afternoon, and is that one of the companies or the company that KDE is going to be working with?
Yeah, we already have a relationship with Panorama. Panorama has done a yeoman's job in helping us create surveys for students, staff, and parents relative to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Okay, so my question would be, because I feel like there's some free resources on their website, but I feel like this discussion today is taking a step further. So I guess that was my question. Will the districts, if we reach out to Panorama, will we have access to resources as a result of the partnership that KDE has with Panorama, or will each district have to create their own individual partnership?
Superintendent Riley, we always want to enjoy the larger partnership, the economy of scale, if you will, that we have. I will talk with Commissioner Glass and Todd, Attorney Allen, about how we can enjoy this economy of scale. But that's a great question, and we can reach out to Panorama again. KDE had this relationship with Panorama long before I arrived here in November, but we want to make sure that is a resource. As you know, that's huge with Commissioner Glass and our state board, that we provide you all with the resources you need to meet the unique needs of your communities.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Dr. Woods Tucker.
Sure. Anything I can do to help out.
Any other questions? Just one last comment. I would maybe steer you towards a national consortium of innovative school districts called Digital Promise.
Yes.
If they are a very very interesting group of folks that are really trying to look across the broad scale of things at the national level. But again, we're doing some heavy work with equity right now. So if you want to jump on digitalpromise.org, you can learn more about it and how you can get connected. Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Okay. No other questions. Item 3, questions and answers. Do any member have any questions? I know it's been a long meeting, and I want to just say I appreciate everyone's approaches today and being prepared and knowing what we want to do as superintendents and as a group. We do always got to remember we are a group of folks that tries to do our best like everybody else does every day. I was putting on my pants this morning, and I said, you know what? Everybody always puts their pants on in the morning. And I said to myself, whatever crazy reason that was, just kind of gives you a little perspective of things in terms of how we all move forward and we get up every morning, and tomorrow morning, hopefully we're all going to be around and we'll put them on again tomorrow. We'll fight whatever battle's in front of us, right? So I do want to thank you all for the cordial understandings today and the conversations, because we all knew it was going to be a difficult one. So at this point in time, I will ask for an adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Raleigh. Need a second.
Russ Tilford, second.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Tilford. We will have a roll call vote. Ms. Meredith.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, I'm sorry. Did I forget something?
Mr. Chair. Yes, no, you didn't forget anything. I just wanted to make one brief comment just on the last point that you made. We delved into some really complex and difficult legal issues this morning, and it's possible for well-intended people who care about each other to disagree, and I think that's where we got to today, and that's okay. We've got a process to get through it, and I just appreciate all the engagement that all of you had with us.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Danny Atkins,
Danny Atkins, yes.
Tim Bobrowski,
yes.
Harry Burchett,
Harry Burchett, yes.
Tom Cochran,
Tom Cochran, yes.
David Cox,
David Cox, yes.
Sheila Mitchell,
Sheila Mitchell, yes.
David Raleigh,
David Raleigh, yes.
Russ Tilford.
Russ Tilford, yes.
Okay.
Chair Kirk Biggerstaff, Keith Hale, and Kelly Ransdell left the meeting early, and so they did not vote. All other members have voted. Okay,
thank you very much for the information. Just do want to remind everyone that our future meeting dates will be on May the 25th, 2021. Hopefully I'll see everybody before then. So meanwhile, if you guys have a good weekend coming up. Feels like a Friday for some odd reason. I don't know. But